Greetings and salutations, this is Derek with Taylor Whips. Have you seen videos of whip cracking where the whip cracker is doing all sorts of crazy maneuvers and not really been able to figure out what they're doing and how? Have you seen videos of specific tricks like the Queensland crossover or the four corners, or even things as simple as the cattleman's crack and the overhead crack, and not really been able to translate those into bodily motion in yourself? This video is specifically tailored to take those types of tricks and make them easier to understand. Specifically, I'm going to propose a new way of thinking about whip cracking that should greatly simplify your whip cracking learning experience. It is my belief that there are only 3 ways to crack a whip. Even though there's a great list of different whip cracks, there are really only 3 ways to make a whip crack, and every other trick is a variation on these same principles. The 3 ways to crack a whip are these. There is the loop crack, there is the hairpin crack, and there is the slack crack. Those are the only ways that a whip can crack. The loop crack is made by changing the whip's direction. You go from swinging the whip in one way to reversing direction, throwing the whip the other way. And it is that reversal of direction that creates a loop that makes the whip crack. Hairpin cracks, by contrast, do not involve a reversal of direction. They take the whip and they throw it directly across without changing direction. To give you a more complete description, a loop crack goes from swinging a whip in one direction, pausing, and throwing the whip in the opposite direction, changing your direction of swing from one way to the other way. Notice how it's going in a full circle, or can go in a full circle, but the direction changes. Crack, there's the change in direction, now I'm going this way. And now I'm back to this. And they cannot be repeated without changing the direction entirely, because they are a change in direction. Hairpin cracks, by contrast, can be repeated because there is no change in direction. Slack cracks function by introducing some slack into an otherwise straight whip. It is very similar to a hairpin crack, but doesn't function by throwing the whip all the way to its full extension, but rather introducing slack somewhere in the length of the whip and then pulling that slack through to get the whip to crack. In this manner, instead of throwing the whip out to its full extension, I am pausing, introducing slack, and then pulling that slack out. A loop crack is all about a change of direction. That being said, all loop cracks are the same. The only thing that changes is the location of where the crack happens. For example, a cattleman's crack, thus, has the crack happen in a vertical plane. The whip goes vertical and stays on vertical the whole time. It never varies. Cattleman's is vertical. If we take the whip and tilt it, we achieve the same crack, but in a different location. So starting vertical, changing the direction a little bit. Now we have a diagonal, changing a little bit more. We have the same crack happening in a horizontal plane. The only difference between the cattleman's crack and the overhead crack is where the whip cracks. This is the same crack as this. It is the same crack. Here's a demonstration of a variety of cracks that have different names, but are all the same type of crack. For example, starting with the cattleman's crack. Single loop crack. Moving it to the overhead plane, it's the same crack. It's called an overhead crack, but it's the same loop crack as happens here. An overhead loop, and at your side loop. If you want to do that behind you, a reverse loop. The reverse of the cattleman's, the exact inverse. This is the reverse cattleman's crack, only because that is where my body happened to be. Here it's the cattleman's. I rotate, here it's at the side, here it's the reverse cattleman's. It's the same crack, all that changes is the location. The exact inverse of the overhead crack, simple loop crack, goes behind you exactly like the reverse cattleman's crack. You can take that same idea and do an upside down overhead. The Tasmanian cutback is the same as a cattleman's crack, but instead of happening directly at your side, all that changes is now it is behind my body. Now it's behind. Now it's in front. Now it's by my side. It's the same crack. The location is all that changes. Hairpin cracks take the same idea of swinging in a circle, but rather than changing the direction entirely, they cut across the circle exactly from one point to another point and have all of this circular motion happen in one specific point. So here I am swinging the whip in a circle. If I pause a little bit and push the whip across the circle, I start to get a little noise. If I push a little further and cut across the circle, I get the crack. And notice the direction of the whip hasn't changed. I'm still swinging in the same direction. If I want to change the direction, I have to do a loop crack. And I can still do the same hairpin motion. Right like that. Using that principle, I can change the location of where I'm swinging to do that same thing in a horizontal plane. I can take that from throwing here to throwing and having it crack right there. Or changing direction, I can continuously cut across the circle and crack in that way. That's a hairpin crack. You get the crack to happen by not making a loop, but by making a hairpin type motion. Instead of making a loop and sending it down the length of the whip, you throw it all the way from one side of the circle to the other without changing direction. The third type of whip crack is the slack crack. The slack cracks are somewhere between a loop crack and a hairpin crack, in that many of them can be repeated, although some of them can't be easily repeated. Somehow they are introducing a loop, but somehow they are introducing merely a hairpin motion. No matter what, the slack cracks are their own class of whip crack because of their execution. They're performed by introducing slack and then pulling that slack out of the whip, as opposed to a straight throw in a single direction. Slack cracks are also the least versatile of all of the whip cracks because they are the most difficult of the cracks to achieve because they involve such a careful introduction of slack into the whip and then pulling it out. That is a highly technical movement that is unlike the straight throws of the hairpin crack and the loop crack. The slack crack can be used to add a little bit more variety and spice into your whip cracking, especially if you're conscious about where the slack is being introduced and where the whip is going to go after you pull the slack out of it. One potential drawback with the slack crack is that it brings the crack closer to your body instead of pushing it farther away, which leads to increased risk of hitting yourself by mistake. Increased risk does not mean that it will hit you, but it means that it is closer to you, and so that's a risk that you have to take into consideration when performing certain tricks. And the slack crack. Ow! Oh! Oh! It left a good-sized welt on my forearm. Now this is best seen in tricks like the Hungarian pig drover's crack and the third crack of the breakaway. I'll demonstrate each. The Hungarian pig drover's crack is something like this. The breakaway involves a loop crack to the front, a loop crack to the back, and then a slack crack that changes the direction from being in the vertical plane to the horizontal plane in this manner. So you'll notice with the breakaway, the third crack happens as I lift up the whip and then pull the slack out of it. With these three ways to crack a whip, there are some slight variations in the mode of execution. For example, in making a loop crack, you can send the loop all the way down the length of the whip, or you can pull the loop through by dropping your elbow. The difference being full extension and dropping the elbow. Dropping the elbow provides some extra tension in the whip. It also brings the crack closer to you, the whip cracker. Dropping the elbow makes it easy to go from crack to crack to crack because you are already reversing the direction of the whip and you're not waiting for it to crack before you start moving again. But it does bring the whip closer to you. Hairpin cracks can also be executed with some variations, just like the loop cracks. You can throw the whip and have it go to full extension, or you can pull the whip through that hairpin crack. The difference being a straight throw all the way out, or a pull through. Anthony DeLongis' system, the rolling loop, implements hairpin cracks as though they were loop cracks in this manner. There is the straight forward throw, which does not make a change of direction, but sends a loop down the length of the thong. Instead of being out straight and a hairpin, it runs in a loop all the way down the thong in this manner. It runs all the way down the length of the whip. And so even though it is a straight throw, even though there's no change in direction, it functions like a loop crack in that it makes a loop, despite it being not a change of direction. It does implement change of direction, but as a part of the system, the straight throws, which act like hairpins, are actually loop cracks, which I think is rather fascinating. Knowing what the three types of cracks are should make learning whip tricks easier, especially when you can look and break down what the cracks are supposed to achieve. Taking Adam Winrich's trick, the 5-pointer, as an example, this trick involves a cattleman's crack, a reverse cattleman's crack, a forward loop throw, which is also the cattleman's crack, where the whip is grounded, and then a flick to the rear, and then a flick forward. So loop, 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 hairpin, hairpin, in this manner. Like so. The cow and the calf involves an upside down or an underhanded hairpin crack, followed up with a loop crack over top. And it looks like this: hairpin, loop, hairpin, like so. I hope that categorizing whip cracks in these ways, loop cracks, hairpin cracks, and slack cracks, will help you on your journey in learning whip cracking. It should make it easier. As you learn new whip routines, I think that you will find that describing the motions in these simple terms, loop cracks, hairpin cracks, and slack cracks, will make it far easier for you to comprehend what's going on and implement it in your own whip cracking. Whip cracking should be a very simple art. There is beauty in simplicity. The more that you understand it in a very basic and straightforward way, the more that you will be able to appreciate the more complex and nuanced implications of this whip art. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this helps you as you learn more about whip cracking. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on my next adventure.